In this video, we're going to be looking at cofunctions and even and odd properties for sine, cosine, and tangent. So the first thing I want to look at is the cofunctions, which are sine of theta is equal to cosine of pi over 2 minus theta. So I first want to start by talking about what this means, the pi over 2 minus theta. So remember that this is a shift of pi over 2. So what I'm saying here is if I shift cosine by pi over 2, I'll end up getting sine. So now I want to show you visually what I'm talking about. So right here I have cosine, and I am saying if I shift it by pi over 2, I should end up with sine. So what I'm doing now is I'm translating the cosine graph to the right by pi over 2. So when the slider goes all the way, it'll be pi over 2, which I think is 1.57. And you can see now that this graph looks like sine. So if I get rid of cosine, this looks just like sine, where you start at 0, you cross through pi, and have your maximum at pi over 2. If I actually graph sine over this, this is sine right here, and you can see how these functions match perfectly. So the same properties apply for secant and cosecant, and tangent and cotangent. This is actually where that co comes from in the word. So sine and cosine are cofunctions, secant and cosecant are cofunctions, and tangent and cotangent are cofunctions. This is a useful property when you want to be able to solve equations and simplify trig functions when the inside is not what you want. Okay, another key concept I want to go over is even and odd properties. We've talked a little bit about this before, how sine of negative theta is equal to negative sine of theta. So I want to show you graphically why this happens. So right now I have sine of x graphed, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to graph negative sine of x. So if you put a negative in front of your function, it's going to make it flip underneath. So that's now negative sine. So our blue graph here is negative sine. And now I'm going to graph sine of negative x. And as you can see, they're the same thing. So the next thing I'm going to do is graph cosine. And I'm going to graph cosine of negative x. Now, what negative x does is it reflects it around the y-axis. So it's going to take these points and flip them over here. And as you can see, it's the same. So now let's look at tangent. If I graph negative tangent of x, it's going to flip it upside down. And negative tangent is the same as tangent of negative x. Okay, so with sine, cosecant, tangent, and cotangent, you can just pull the negative right out to the front, as you see here. And what's actually cool with cosine is the negative just goes away. All right, example 3. So if tangent of theta is equal to 1.28, I want to know what is cotangent of theta minus pi over 2. So this almost looks like our identity. However, our identity is cotangent of pi over 2 minus theta. So we can't use the identity unless it looks exactly like that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out a negative from the inside. So I get pi over 2 minus theta. And then with cotangent, the negative just comes out to the front. So you get this as negative cotangent of pi over 2 minus theta. And now I can use the property that cotangent of pi over 2 minus theta is equal to just tangent of theta. And I knew that tangent of theta was 1.28. So my answer is negative 1.28. So now on your own, I want you to try these, see if you can work them out. Okay, so we have sine of x is negative 0.37, and I want to know what cosine of x minus pi over 2 is. Again, this looks very close to my identity. However, it's not exactly it. So I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to factor out the negative. So this becomes cosine of pi over 2 minus x. Because with cosine, this negative just goes away. So now I'm going to get this becomes sine of x, and we knew sine of x was negative 0.37, so my answer is just negative 0.37. Okay, so for part B, I want to find sine of x minus pi over 2. It's a little bit different than the last one because we're finding sine and not cosine. So I'm going to factor out the negative again. And I get pi over 2 minus x. And then this negative, because sine is odd, is going to come out to the front. So I get negative sine of pi over 2 minus x. And then negative sine of pi over 2 minus x is cosine of x. So negative, and cosine of x was negative 0.75. So a negative and a negative make a positive. So you get 0.75.